Thank you all so much to Tali and Emra for having me out. Good evening to all of you. Good morning from my vantage point. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to be very forthright about the paper that this talk was based on, which was written about 5 years ago at this point, but I think is still relevant. Because I wrote it initially, very much with an American or most Anglo-American audience in mind. But this is the third or fourth time that a kind of continental European audience has invited me to speak on that. And it clearly seems to have some resonance beyond that, which I'm incredibly, obviously gratified to learn and to hear and to learn from you how these ideas, how these concepts translate in different social and national contexts. Schraub notwithstanding, I don't speak a lick of German, but I'm really excited and really grateful to be able to present before this audience. So the subject of this paper and of this talk, as the title implies, is white Jews. And by that, I mean to evoke two related but distinct concepts. One is white Jews, as in those particular Jews who, if it weren't for the fact that they were Jewish, would be unambiguously white, right? So in my case, for example, if you look at me, you look at the color of my skin, you look at where, my parents and my grandparents and my great-grandparents are from, there would be no problem identifying me as white, except for the fact that I'm Jewish. And there are absolutely Jews who don't fall into that category, right? You think about Ethiopian Jews or Yemenite Jews or African-American Jews. But there are some Jews who are in this situation of being white, except for the fact that Jewishness makes it complicated. And while we can call such Jews conditionally white or functionally white or white but not quite, for simplicity's sake, I'm just referring to them as white Jews. But beyond the individual, labeling of particular persons, there's also this broader generalization about Jews writ large. The Jew is archetypically white. So that when we, and by we here, I mean not just Jews, but non-Jews as well, envision Jews. When we come to mind the image of the Jew, the type of Jew we typically think of is the white Jew as expressed a moment ago. It is the Jew who is from or whose grandparents are from, Russia or Austria, or Germany. It's not typically, the Yemenite Jew or the African-American Jew, or even the Mizrahi Jew. So those two concepts, fitting them together, right? My approach for kind of assessing them, and this is sort of our march through the title, is an intersectional approach. And by intersectionality, I want to be very clear about what I mean, because this is a term that's often kind of thrown about and has some casual meanings that I don't think are necessarily accurately reflected in the actual academic concept. Intersectionality is not simply just ladling different oppressions, species of power, or identities on top of one another. Sometimes this is expressed as, we add the fight against racism to the fight against anti-Semitism to the fight against sexism, and we throw them all together, and then you have intersectionality. And that's not really what intersectionality is. Intersectionality is more specific than that, and it's looking at how the interaction of various identity groupings, for example, Blackness and womanness, to use the classic example, yields particularized sets of experiences which are not reducible to a combination of how the constituent parts, Blackness, womanness, are viewed in their simplicity, right? Instead, we're asking, what do these identities do to each other in combination? And so my question for this paper is, what do the identities of whiteness and Jewishness do to each other when they're placed in combination with one another, when they're placed side by side? And my answer to the question, what does whiteness do to Jewishness, is that whiteness puts an emphasis on certain characteristics which in the Jewish context can easily accentuate or accelerate anti-Semitism and facilitate Jewish exclusion. I'm going to be focusing on two in particular, power, and then this idea of hegemony or invisibility or omnipresence. That's the main objective. There's a secondary objective here too, which is that, most literature on intersectionality, most people who deem themselves intersectionalist haven't typically included Jews, and many Jewish writers are accordingly somewhat suspicious of intersectionality. And so my, side project of this talk is to explain that omission while showing why intersectionality is a useful term or useful form of analysis. Intersectionality is the cure. It is not the disease when it comes to the types of problems that I am laying out. And finally, the goal of this, though, those are the two goals. The not goal, the thing I am not trying to do here, because I don't think it's true, is not to say that white Jews as individuals do not, in many cases, benefit from white privilege in a Western context. Right? I'm not saying that white Jews aren't really white, or there is no circumstances in which a white Jew cannot enjoy white privilege in a contemporary Western society. Rather, disentangling what whiteness is doing to Jewishness such that it seems to accentuate certain forms of anti-Semitism can also clear space for a more honest reckoning with the ways that white Jews can, in some circumstances, be beneficiaries of white supremacist systems in certain contexts, while also being victimized by white supremacy or victimized by this particular confluence of Jewish and whiteness in other contexts. So intersectionality is a term that's often used very loosely, but whenever we talk about it, I think it's important to ground the arguments in an actual text, because these terms aren't just catch-alls to mean whatever people want them to mean, and they're certainly not catch-alls in a way that I think, unfortunately, they are often used as a term for just any bad behavior coming from the left that's vaguely identity politics related to it. And so the easiest way to constrain ourselves and make sure that we're being honest in our usage of terms is to tie the term itself to arguments made in key textual accounts. And I've often heard people who try to be a little bit looser in their use of intersectionality justify this by saying, well, maybe the original theory means what you say it means, David, but this no longer tracks how this concept is used on the ground or in the real world. And therefore, it doesn't really matter if their account of intersectionality tracks the relevant academic literature because it fits a popular definition. It's certainly true that terms and context can have evolving meaning, but I'm really worried about that reply kind of enabling methodological anarchy and naked cherry picking. If one doesn't ground in text, how do we know that the phenomenon we're talking about actually has anything to do with intersectionality? It might just be bog standard normal anti-Semitism, for example, and really have nothing to do with intersectionality whatsoever. And so we end up seeing arguments made by circular stipulation that such and such bad behavior is intersectionality, and if challenged to support that interpretations with warrants from key intersectionality texts, you demur on the grounds that the examples of bad behavior suffice to establish a new definition of intersectionality. And that's just a polemical sleight of hand. I don't think that's a valid move. So I want to ground myself in Kimberly Crenshaw's initial set of articles where she coined and kind of explicated the concept of intersectionality, which is that intersectionality is a means of articulating specific points of exclusion or marginalization experienced amongst multiply marginalized persons, for example, Black women. It criticizes a common method of resolving problems faced by the multiply marginalized, the so-called additive approach, whereby we just tack on more and more anti-oppression commitments to one another, and eventually we get to all of them. And the problem that Crenshaw identifies is that it misses how this additive approach misses how the interaction of identity categories changes their content. If sexism, for example, is understood by reference to white women's experience, then adding it to the anti-racism mix won't necessarily speak to the particularized experiences of Black women. And framed this way, we can make very similar observations with respect to Jewish categories as well. That, Jewish women isn't necessarily included just by taking Jew and women and adding them together. There's definitely been people who have done this work, but in practice, not that much, right? I had done a bit even before this paper with Ana Lucia Lopez Rojeredo. Marla Brettschneider has a wonderful book out on Jewish feminism and intersectionality. Cynthia Levine-Rasky has written on this. So there's some, but not that much. And one of the more novel contributions, I think, in the project I'm working on is that while most intersectional work is focused on multiply marginalized persons, my project looks at a dominant plus marginal interaction, white plus Jew, dominant plus marginal, right? I'm not the first to do this. Again, Cynthia Levine-Rasky, even in the Jewish case, has already done it. But I'm pushing towards what's sometimes called the critical whiteness literature, which attacks the notion of whiteness as being, quote unquote, colorless, right? A neutral or transparent baseline, and instead recognizes how whiteness possesses certain contingent and specific properties of its own, demand analysis more particularized than simple humanism. So as applied to this project, an intersectional method takes properties or functions which whiteness serves in contemporary Western contexts, and then asks what happens when these properties or these functions interact with the set of properties or functions that Jews either do possess or are imagined to possess. So I'll give an example that maybe can illustrate how this works in practice. At Stanford University here in the States, there was a debate amongst the student government over a resolution which sought to condemn anti-Semitism and identified one form of anti-Semitism as saying Jews control the media, economy, government, and other societal institutions. One student senator objected to that clause and said that the clause says Jews controlling the media, economy, government, and other societal institutions is a feature of anti-Semitism that we theoretically shouldn't challenge. I think that's kind of irresponsible foraying into another politically contentious conversation. Questioning these potential power dynamics, I think, is not anti-Semitism. I think it's a very valid discussion. And from the senator's vantage point, right, I think what he's saying is something like this. Critiquing white supremacy means identifying and criticizing distributions of power. So if that's what we are doing when we criticize white supremacy, how can this critique become problematic when applied to a particular subset of white people? And here we mean the Jews, right? We're very familiar with the strategies of denial that are often employed here about reverse racism, rabble-rousing, it's divisive. There's nothing new under the sun. And we certainly don't want to jettison the discourse criticizing white supremacy entirely, because it's often very important. It's very right. But on the flip side, from a Jewish vantage point, anti-Semitism is frequently all about identifying Jews as possessor of ill-gotten and illegitimate power. So we say, how does this become suddenly legitimized, a legitimate conversation, just because it drapes itself as a progressive move, as an anti-white supremacy move? And again, the strategies of denial, of censorship, of being silenced, there's nothing new here either. So what explains this sort of talking past each other from the student senator and the Stanford Jewish community, right? Well, my argument is not that the Stanford senator's statement was anti-Semitic because it adhered to intersectionality. It's that intersectionality explains how the Stanford student's statement was anti-Semitic in a way that might otherwise be obscured if we lacked an intersectional lens, right? Once we see how the combination of Jewishness and whiteness acts to mean that the intersection of whiteness and Jewishness allows for the acceleration and the validation of something that otherwise might obviously seem to be anti-Semitic, right? Then we can identify perhaps a form of anti-Semitism that might otherwise have been obscured. So intersectionality, to reiterate, is not the problem, it is the solution, right? It gets us out of this mess where we either neuter discourse about white supremacy or we permit seemingly obvious anti-Semitic tropes to go unchallenged. So for our purposes, I want to talk through two crucial characteristics of whiteness, which I think interact with Jewishness in important and often troublesome ways. The first is that of power, the idea of whiteness as enabling, it offers opportunities, it opens doors. And the second is that of hegemony, of omnipresence or invisibility. Whiteness has the default. The prerogatives of whiteness are not seen or perceived because they're just the way things are. And we can very easily map both of these onto, I think, aspects of anti-Semitism. First, the norm of Jewish hyperpower, the idea of Jews as controlling, dominant, a cabal or conspiracy, but also the notion of Jews as indistinct, right? They've been superseded and can be subsumed into a larger rubric of Judeo-Christian, right, or Western civilization. There's no independent modern Jewish contribution to history. So if we start with the power side of the ledger, whiteness analytically is designed to reveal the power and hegemony, right? It's a counterweight to the popular portrayal and self-conception of white people as, just a person, right? Hardworking, nobody handed me anything, and so on and so forth. and instead underscores privileges, prerogatives, power that is associated with being white in white supremacist societies. But the thing is, Jews aren't just people, right? Jews are defined precisely by reference to their supposed power and privileges and prerogatives. So instead of serving as a counterweight, right, the whiteness frame serves as an accelerant. Rather than unsettling received expectations, it confirms them. I always thought of Jews as being this really powerful group, and see how right I was. And so white supremacists even as they of course deny Jewish whiteness, still treat Jews as embodying the above characteristics, Jews as domineering, controlling, the omnipresent power behind the scene. And so even and perhaps especially for white supremacists, anti-Semitism is viewed as a form of punching up, attacking power structures. And the implication of this vantage is that Jews are not, and in most cases cannot be, truly marginalized. They embody what it means to be empowered in political, cultural, and economic dimensions. But on top of that, there's this idea of Jewish hegemony, that Jews are known, right? They are part of dominant categories which are omnipresent and which everyone has access to, even if only implicitly. One need not, under this vantage point, expend any effort learning about distinctively Jewish vantages or distinctively Jewish cases, because Jews are already included in the default offerings of social knowledge represented by hegemonic narratives, for example, the Judeo-Christian tradition or the Western canon. The logic of Jewish whiteness, of Jews defined as both powerful and omnipresent, also acts to self-insulate. It explains, or at least helps explain, the paucity of literature exploring this as an anti-Semitic phenomenon. On the non-radical right, Jews are included within dominant categories to offer a patina of diversity, but only insofar as they don't challenge pre-existing narratives, such as Jews as a model minority, the perfect assimilators, Judeo-Christian, and so on. On the left, if the goal of such literature is to remedy exclusion, and Jews are already assumed to be included, either by virtue of their social power or their incorporation within a broader Western or Judeo-Christian canon, then efforts to demand a uniquely Jewish perspective on the problem sounds like the rich just wanting to get richer. So in either case, seeding Jews into the category of white or Judeo-Christian means that one need not think about Jews any further. And so we see this sort of tension between a presupposition, I think a very powerful and popular presupposition, that Jewish issues saturate the social discourse, even though in actuality there frequently is very little talk about Jews and Jewish cases. And I imagine that anybody who's worked in this arena, and I feel this myself, has felt that anxiety where our efforts to demand inclusion are, we're worried, are we sucking oxygen out of the room? Are we taking over the space? Even in very modest interventions, right? There's a gap between the relatively small attention that anti-Semitism gets in the relevant literature and the pervasive view that it gets a disproportionately large amount of the attention. And I think what's happening here is that Jewish history is written back into the larger category of white history, which has already been taken care of. And so calls for a specific focus on Jews is akin to What About White History Month, right? Accelerated by tropes of Jewish hyperpower. So to conclude, and then I'm going to give a brief proscript before opening to questions, Jewishness being read into and subsumed by whiteness has three main impacts. For individual white Jews, anti-Semitism is rendered unintelligible except to the extent that it can be racialized so as to plausibly deny Jewish whiteness. For example, in the case of Nazi Germany, either Jews are not white, as for Nazis, and anti-Semitism exists, or Jews are white and anti-Semitism is gone. And so we lose the space to talk about anti-Semitism in context where there's a plausible case of Jewish whiteness. Second, for non-white Jews, identification of Jewishness as epitomizing whiteness means that to the extent they identify as normatively Jewish or articulate specific Jewish problems, they are whitened because Jewishness equals white. And meanwhile, to the extent they diverge from normative Jewish practices or offer critiques, they're de-Judaized because, again, Jewish equals white. And this acts as an additional form of marginalization for non-white Jews being forced into the Jews as white rubric. And finally, insofar as Jews perceive the identification of Jews as white as an obstacle to the cohesive tackling of anti-Semitic oppression, Some respond by denying Jews experience white privilege in any respect whatsoever. I'm not white, I'm Jewish. And so we occlude the ability to have a more nuanced discussion of Jewishness and whiteness. Now, as a quick postscript, I mentioned that I wrote this paper, the paper this was based on, about 5 years ago, and it's gotten actually a very positive reception. But as things go, I've been reflecting on how it's been received and developments that have occurred. Right? I think since that time, intersectionality is still kind of the bugaboo for many Jewish commentators. Maybe it's getting even worse, and the view that this field of intersectionality is irredeemably hostile to Jews. And so I just want to be very clear that that has not been my experience. Right? I have presented this work in front of not just Jewish audiences or anti-Semitism audiences, but critical race theory, intersectionality audiences as well, to perfectly positive reception. Right? There is a gap between discourse and reality that is wild in the degree to which it is mismatched here. Now, this doesn't mean that there aren't problems or gaps, and the critical race theory literature is full of people who are identifying and criticizing these sorts of gaps. But the idea that there is this sort of irredeemable hostility within CRT or intersectionality spaces, I don't think is borne out by the reality of it. And the fact is that while anti-Semitism, including left-wing anti-Semitism, is absolutely a serious problem, it's not a problem that I think is caused by or even substantially contributed to by intersectionality. And to the contrary, intersectionality, in my experience, both helps cast a sharper lens on the problem and illuminate how it can be productively combated. I use intersectionality in my work because it is useful. And I think refusing to use a useful tool is foolishness. There will always be bad actors, but there isn't this implacable resistance that is sometimes asserted to the notion that intersectionality is validly applied to a Jewish case. The second thing I observed when I gave this paper, and as I present it more recently, I try to push back on this more explicitly, is that many people share the thesis of my argument with comments to the effect of, this is why it's anti-Semitic to call Jews white. And that's not my thesis. Again, I want to be very, very clear that there are absolutely contexts and circumstances where Jews can validly be considered white. And so one example that I like to give is the case of Solomon Blatt, who was a Jewish man, and he was the Speaker of the South Carolina State House of Representatives for most of the period between 1937 and 1973, which is to say the heart of Jim Crow and explicit white supremacy in the South, right? You do not become the Speaker of the South Carolina House of Representatives in 1937 unless people accept you are white. Now, so we need a theory then, right, for how Jews can both be obviously white, in Blatt's case as Speaker, and yet simultaneously obviously not, as in the case of the KKK or Nazi Germany across the pond, often in the same time, often even in the same place in South Carolina, right? Intersectionality helps get us that theory. We could just say that racism, misogyny, anti-Semitism are different axes of oppression, and so Blatt is just white and benefiting from white supremacy while still facing potentially severe anti-Semitism along another dimension, right? And one way of thinking through the problem of this paper is, why doesn't that frame seem to stick, right? Why is it the case that so many people who, say Jews are white pivot to saying, and therefore anti-Semitism can't be a problem, right? And I think there's two reasons for that. One is that, well, Jews who look like me can in many contexts strategically claim and disclaim whiteness kind of as it suits. And using Jewishness to disclaim whiteness serves to shunt off responsibilities without actually dispensing with privileges, but partially because Jewish whiteness is not taken to coexist with, but rather to obliterate anti-Semitism as a relative axis of oppression, particularly, though not exclusively, vis-a-vis non-white, non-Jews, right? Because an implication of the separate axes argument is that non-Jews of any race or sex or sexuality are privileged over Jews along the axis of anti-Semitism, just as men of any race or religion or ethnicity are privileged over women along the axes of sex, right? And I think that conclusion is one that people very sharply resist, and figuring out why that resistance is there is helpfully presented as helpfully interrogated by looking more closely at the relationship between Jewishness and whiteness, and not pivoting to fundamentalism in either direction, either that Jews simply are white without qualification, or Jews can never be white in any context whatsoever. Ultimately, my experience is that the best way to fight anti-Semitism, whether left or right, is to insist on including Jews with vigor, telling our stories honestly, incorporating our narratives into broader accounts of racial, ethnic, and political justice, and standing firm against efforts that suggest that the fight for Jews is inherently divorced from or antagonistic to the fights for rights and equality of every marginalized and discriminated group. These do fit together, right? And the tools that have been developed, like intersectionality, that have borne tremendous fruit in providing a richer understanding of concepts like racism or misogyny or Islamophobia, can do the same thing for anti-Semitism as well. So I think I will leave it there. I suggested 25 minutes to Tali, and I went 30, so I think that's okay. But I'm really excited to have a conversation, to get any feedback and answer any questions that you all have.